"I don't have anyone to call." That's what she said. My CEO, standing at my door at 5 in the morning, mascara running down her face, wearing slippers. The most powerful woman I'd ever known, and she was shaking like a lost child. Behind me, my 7-year-old daughter asked the question that would change everything. "Daddy, does the sad lady want some warm milk?" The knock came at 5 in the morning. Not a polite tap, not the hesitant rhythm of a neighbor needing sugar. This was urgent, almost desperate. 3 sharp strikes that shattered the silence of Carlos Thompson's apartment like stones through glass. He was already half awake, caught in that gray space between sleep and consciousness where single fathers often lived. 7 years of raising Zoe alone had rewired his brain to register every creak, every whisper, every sound that didn't belong to the night. But this sound was different. This sound meant trouble. Carlos rolled out of bed, his feet finding the cold hardwood floor. He grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the nightstand, a habit from the old neighborhood, and moved through the darkness toward the front door. The clock on the microwave read 5:03 as he passed the kitchen. Through the peephole, he saw something that made no sense. Rachel Caldwell stood in his hallway, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold her body together. The CEO of Meridian Technologies, the woman whose face graced business magazines and whose name commanded respect in boardrooms across the country, was standing outside his door at 5 in the morning, looking like she'd survived a shipwreck. Her mascara had bled down her cheeks in dark rivers. Her hair, usually sculpted into corporate perfection, hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. She wore a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than his monthly rent, but it was wrinkled, slept in, wrong. Everything about her was wrong. Carlos opened the door but kept the chain on. Through the gap, he could see her hands trembling. "Mr. Thompson." Her voice cracked on his name. I didn't know where else to go. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here. Whether you found this story through a late-night scroll or a friend's recommendation, I'm glad you're listening. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy stories like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's get back to Carlos and that unexpected knock. "Ms. Caldwell, it's 5 in the morning." "I know." She looked down at her feet, and he noticed she was wearing slippers. Designer slippers, but slippers nonetheless. She'd driven across the city in slippers. "I know this is inappropriate. I know this crosses every line, but I've been sitting in my car for 3 hours, and I scrolled through 800 contacts in my phone, and I realized something terrifying." She looked up at him, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the hallway, he saw it. The thing behind the power suits and the confident stride and the reputation that made grown men nervous. He saw emptiness. "I don't have anyone to call," she said. "Not one person I can talk to at 3 in the morning without explaining why. Not one person who would just listen without wanting something in return. And you think I'm that person?" "No." She shook her head. "I don't think anything. I just remembered that you're the only person at Meridian who's never been afraid of me. And right now, I need someone who isn't afraid." Carlos stood there, the chain still between them, weighing his options. He was a 34-year-old operations coordinator, 4 years at the company, deliberately invisible. He'd built his entire life around being safe, predictable, unmemorable. After his wife left, after she looked him in the eyes and told him he lacked ambition, that he'd never be enough, he'd made a conscious choice. No risks, no drama, no situations that could blow up in his face and leave Zoe without stability. This situation had explosion written all over it. "Daddy?" The small voice came from behind him, and Carlos turned to see Zoe standing in the hallway. Her pink pajamas slightly too short because she was growing faster than he could keep up with. She rubbed her eyes with one fist, her braids messy from sleep. "Go back to bed, baby." But Zoe had already spotted the figure through the gap in the door. Her 7-year-old curiosity was stronger than her drowsiness. "Who's that?" Rachel's face changed. The desperation cracked into something else, something almost like recognition. She stared at the little girl with an expression Carlos couldn't read. "This is someone from Daddy's work," Carlos said carefully. "She's having a hard night." Zoe processed this information with the simple logic of childhood. She looked at Rachel's tear-streaked face, at her trembling hands, and came to an immediate conclusion. "Do you want some warm milk?" Zoe asked. "Daddy makes it for me when I'm sad. He puts a little honey in it." Rachel's composure, whatever remained of it, collapsed. Her hand flew to her mouth and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. Carlos watched one of the most powerful women in corporate America cry in his hallway because a 7-year-old offered her warm milk. He removed the chain. Rachel came inside, and he directed her to the couch while he took Zoe back to bed. His daughter had questions, naturally. She always had questions. "Is the lady going to be okay?" "She's going to be fine. Sometimes grown-ups have bad nights." "Like when you used to sit in the kitchen after Mommy left?" The words hit Carlos in the chest. He thought he'd hidden those nights better. Apparently not. "Yeah, baby." "Like that?" "Then she definitely needs warm milk." Carlos tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and told her to stay in her room until he came to get her. Then he went back to the living room, where Rachel Caldwell sat on his second-hand couch, looking utterly lost. He made 2 cups of tea because he didn't think warm milk was appropriate for this conversation, and he sat in the armchair across from her, maintaining distance. "Start from the beginning," he said. "Why are you here?" Rachel wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her fingers. When she spoke, her voice was flat, drained. "I signed my divorce papers tonight. 8 years of marriage, and it took 45 minutes to end it. My lawyer had champagne ready. He thought we were celebrating. I'm sorry. Don't be. The marriage was dead long before tonight." She took a sip of tea, and he noticed that she held the mug like it was the only solid thing in her world. "Do you know why my husband left? Everyone assumes it was another woman, or that I was too focused on the company, or that we grew apart. The usual excuses." "Why did he leave?" Rachel looked at him directly, and in that moment, she wasn't a CEO. She wasn't the woman who'd built a startup into a $200 million empire. She was just a person who'd realized something terrible about herself. "Because I never let him see me weak. Not once in 8 years. He told me at the end that he felt like he'd been married to a statue. Beautiful, impressive, but cold. Untouchable." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "The thing is, he was right. I don't know how to be vulnerable with someone without feeling like I'm handing them a weapon." Carlos said nothing. He understood that impulse more than she knew. "So tonight, after I signed the papers, I drove home. I have this penthouse overlooking the river. 4,000 square feet. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 3 hours because I couldn't make myself go up there. I couldn't face the empty rooms and the silence and the proof that I've spent 40 years becoming someone who has everything except a single person who knows the real me." "Why me?" Carlos asked. "You have hundreds of employees, board members, investors. Why show up at my door?" Rachel set down her mug and looked at him with something approaching honesty. 3 months ago, at the quarterly meeting, do you remember?" Carlos remembered. David Porter, one of the senior VPs, had publicly challenged Rachel's decision to restructure the logistics division. It was a power play, an attempt to make her look weak in front of the entire company. The room had gone silent, everyone waiting to see blood. "You stood up," Rachel said. "You asked a question about the implementation timeline. A neutral question, completely professional, but it redirected the whole conversation. You saved me from having to destroy David in front of everyone, which would have made me look petty, or back down, which would have made me look weak. I was just asking about the timeline." "No." Rachel shook her head. You were the only person in that room who saw a human being in a difficult spot instead of a CEO to be feared or manipulated. And afterward, I started paying attention to you. Carlos felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest. Paying attention how? I noticed that you're the only person who doesn't change when I walk into a room. Everyone else either stiffens up or starts performing. You just keep being yourself. I noticed that you turn down every after-hours event because you need to pick up your daughter. I noticed that you don't have LinkedIn Premium or a personal brand or any of the things people use to climb the ladder. Maybe I'm just not ambitious. Or maybe you've figured out something the rest of us haven't. Rachel leaned back against the couch, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. You have a life, Mr. Thompson, a real one, with a daughter who offers strangers warm milk and an apartment that feels like home instead of a showcase. I've been building my empire for 15 years, and tonight I realized I would trade all of it for what you have. The silence stretched between them. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up, the first gray light of dawn creeping through the windows. Carlos made a decision. It wasn't the safe choice. It wasn't the smart choice. But when he looked at Rachel Caldwell, he didn't see a CEO or a threat or an opportunity. He saw someone who'd hit bottom and had nowhere else to fall. You can stay until morning, he said. But there are rules. You sleep on the couch. My daughter's door stays unlocked. You leave before she wakes up. And whatever this is, whatever brought you here tonight, it stays in this apartment. At work, nothing changes. Rachel nodded slowly. And after tonight? After tonight, we pretend this never happened. You go back to being the CEO. I go back to being invisible. That's the only way this doesn't become a disaster for both of us. Agreed. He got her a blanket and a pillow, and she lay down on his couch, still wearing her designer slippers. As he turned to go back to his room, her voice stopped him. Mr. Thompson, Carlos. It was the first time she'd used his first name. Thank you for not turning me away. He stood in the doorway, looking at this woman who controlled the fates of hundreds of employees, who commanded respect from titans of industry, who'd never shown weakness to anyone in her adult life. She looked small on his couch, human. Everyone deserves warm milk sometimes, he said. It wasn't until he was back in his bed, staring at the ceiling, that Carlos realized what he'd done. He'd let something dangerous into his carefully constructed life, something that could cost him his job, his reputation, his stability. But as he drifted towards sleep, he couldn't shake the image of Rachel Caldwell crying in his hallway. He couldn't forget the look in her eyes when she said she had no one to call. He'd been there. After his wife left, after she told him he'd never be enough, he'd sat in that same darkness. The only difference was that he'd had Zoe. He'd had a reason to keep going. Rachel had nothing but an empty penthouse and 800 contacts who meant nothing. Maybe that was why he'd opened the door. Maybe that was why he'd broken his own rules about staying safe and invisible, because he knew what it felt like to be alone in the dark with no one coming to help. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have predicted, was that this single night would set in motion something that would force both of them to face truths they'd spent their entire lives avoiding. But that reckoning was still to come. For now, there was only the silence of the early morning and two people in separate rooms, both pretending they could go back to normal, both knowing they couldn't. 2 weeks passed, and Carlos kept his word. At Meridian Technologies, nothing changed. Rachel Caldwell walked through the halls with the same commanding presence she'd always had. Her heels clicked against marble floors with authority. Her voice in meetings carried the weight of someone who'd built an empire from nothing. If anything, she seemed even more controlled than before, her walls rebuilt higher and thicker. Carlos watched her from a distance, maintaining the invisibility he'd cultivated for 4 years. When she entered the elevator, he didn't flinch. When she addressed the operations team in weekly briefings, he took notes like everyone else. They existed in parallel lines that would never intersect, at least not where anyone could see. but the secret lived between them like a third presence. He'd catch her glancing his way during company meetings, a flicker so brief that anyone else would miss it. He'd feel her eyes on him in the cafeteria, then look up to find her already turning away. Once they ended up alone in the elevator for 37 floors, and neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening. At home, Zoe asked about the sad lady from that night. "Is she feeling better, Daddy?" Carlos was making dinner, stirring pasta while Zoe sat at the kitchen counter doing homework. The question caught him off guard, even though he'd been expecting it for days. "I think so, baby. You should invite her for dinner. Your pasta always makes people happy." He smiled at his daughter's simple logic. If only adult problems could be solved with pasta and warm milk. "It's complicated, Zoe. She's someone important at Daddy's work. We can't just have dinner together." "Why not?" "Because the world doesn't work that way," he thought. "Because people like her and people like me exist in different orbits. Because if anyone found out she'd spent the night on my couch, even innocently, it would destroy us both." "Grown-up stuff," he said instead. "Now finish your math." The question that haunted Carlos wasn't about Rachel's feelings. It was about his own place in whatever was happening between them. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she'd chosen him because of who he was or because of what he represented. Was he a person to her, or just an escape hatch? A symbol of the simple life she'd never had? His ex-wife had left because he wasn't enough. Not ambitious enough, not driven enough, not willing to sacrifice everything for success. What if Rachel was drawn to him for the exact same reasons? What if she saw in him not a partner, but a retreat, a place to hide when the pressure became too much, only to return to her real world when she'd recovered? He'd been someone's backup plan before. He refused to be one again. 1 month after that night, everything shifted. Carlos received a meeting request from the CEO's office. Official business, the calendar invitation said, regarding operational restructuring. He spent the morning convincing himself it was legitimate, that Rachel needed his input on some logistics issue, that this was purely professional. Her assistant showed him into the corner office at 3 in the afternoon. Rachel sat behind her massive desk, looking every bit the corporate titan in her charcoal blazer and perfectly styled hair. But when the door closed and they were alone, something in her posture softened. "Sit down, Carlos." He took the chair across from her, maintaining professional distance. "What's this about?" Rachel didn't answer immediately. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, stripped of its boardroom authority. "I'm being offered $300 million for the company." Carlos absorbed this information. It was significant, but he didn't understand why she was telling him. "Congratulations. That's a substantial offer. The board wants me to take it. They've been pushing for an exit strategy for years, and this is the perfect opportunity." She turned to face him. "I'm considering it." "Again, congratulations. You don't understand." Rachel moved closer, leaning against the front of her desk. The distance between them shrank to something almost intimate. "If I sell the company, I'm not staying on. I'm walking away completely. No golden handcuffs, no advisory role, no transition period longer than absolutely necessary. I'm done. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only person who'll give me an honest answer." Her eyes met his, and he saw the same vulnerability from that night on his couch. "If I do this, if I give up everything I've built, the power dynamic between us disappears. I won't be your CEO anymore. You won't be my employee. And then we'll have to figure out what this actually is." Carlos felt the ground shift beneath him. She was asking a question that had nothing to do with business strategy. "Is that what this is really about?" he asked carefully. "You're thinking about selling a $200 million company because of whatever's happening between us?" "No, yes. I don't know. Rachel pushed away from the desk and began pacing. I've been running on empty for 15 years, building this empire, sacrificing everything, telling myself it would be worth it someday. And then I signed those divorce papers, and I realized I have nothing, just money and power and an empty penthouse. So when I think about selling, it's not because of you, but you're part of the equation. You showed me what a real life looks like. I'm not a life plan, Rachel. I'm not a solution to your problems. I know that. Do you? Because it sounds like you're asking me whether you should blow up your entire career, and I can't be responsible for that decision. Rachel stopped pacing. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You're right. I'm sorry. That wasn't fair. No, it wasn't. The silence between them stretched thin. Carlos stood, preparing to leave, but Rachel's voice stopped him. I'm not asking you to decide for me. I'm asking you something else entirely. She took a breath. Are you asking about the business deal, or are you asking whether I want you to stay? The question hung in the air. Carlos knew what she was really asking. She wanted to know if there was something worth staying for, something beyond the company and the power and the isolation she'd built around herself. He should have lied. He should have told her that whatever existed between them was nothing more than a moment of human connection, never to be repeated. That would have been the safe answer, the smart answer. Instead, he told her the truth. I don't know what this is. I don't know if it's real or if I'm just convenient, but I know that I haven't stopped thinking about that night since it happened. And I know that scares me more than anything has in a long time. Rachel's expression shifted. Something like hope flickered in her eyes. So what do we do? I don't know that either, but I know that you can't make a $300 million decision based on a man you barely know. Figure out what you want for yourself first. Then we can talk about what comes next. He left her office without looking back. The rumors started 2 weeks later. Someone had seen Rachel leaving Carlos's building at 6 in the morning, back on the night she'd shown up at his door. The information had been sitting dormant for over a month, waiting for the right moment to detonate. That moment came when a junior analyst mentioned it to a friend, who mentioned it to a colleague, who mentioned it in the break room where the wrong ears were listening. By the end of the week, half the company believed Carlos Thompson was sleeping with the CEO. The whispers followed him through the halls. Conversations stopped when he entered rooms. Colleagues who'd been friendly for years suddenly couldn't meet his eyes. He heard fragments of speculation in the elevator, in the bathroom, in the cafeteria line. Guess we know how he's kept his job this long. Always the quiet ones, right? Think she's going through a midlife crisis? Slumming it with the help? Carlos endured it in silence. He'd learned long ago that defending yourself against rumors only made them spread faster. But the weight of it pressed down on him, heavier each day. HR called him in for an unofficial conversation. The woman across the desk, someone named Patricia, smiled sympathetically while asking questions that weren't really questions. We've heard some concerning rumors about your relationship with Ms. Caldwell. Now, we're not accusing anyone of anything, but we want to make sure there's nothing inappropriate happening that might create a hostile work environment or compromise the integrity of our leadership structure. Carlos kept his voice steady. Ms. Caldwell and I have no personal relationship. We've barely spoken outside of official company business. Patricia nodded, making notes. And you've never seen her outside of work? Never had any contact with her beyond what would be normal for an employee in your position? The lie sat on his tongue, ready to be spoken. One night, one innocent night on a couch with a blanket and tea and no physical contact whatsoever. It was nothing. It meant nothing. Except it did mean something. It meant everything. And lying about it felt like a betrayal of whatever fragile trust they'd built. No, Carlos said. Nothing beyond normal professional interaction. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. That night, Rachel called him. It was the first time they'd spoken since the conversation in her office. Her voice was tight with controlled anger. "I heard about the HR meeting. I'm so sorry, Carlos. This is exactly what I was afraid of." "It's not your fault." "Of course it's my fault. I showed up at your door. I dragged you into my mess. And now your reputation is being destroyed because of me." Carlos sat on his couch, the same couch where she'd slept that night. Zoe was in her room, doing homework, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around her father. "What are you going to do about the sale?" he asked, changing the subject. Rachel was silent for a moment. "The board is meeting next week to vote on the offer. If they approve it, the deal moves forward. If they don't, I'll have to find another way out." "And what do you want?" "I want to stop feeling like I'm drowning. I want to wake up one morning without the weight of 700 employees and 60 million in quarterly targets on my chest. I want to remember who I was before I became this thing, this CEO, this brand." Her voice cracked. "And I want to stop hurting people, including you." "Rachel, listen to me." Carlos gripped the phone tighter. "Whatever you decide it for yourself. Not for me. Not because of what's happening with the rumors. I survived my wife leaving. I survived raising Zoe alone. I'll survive this too. And us? What happens to us? I don't know. But I know that right now, everything is too complicated. You're my CEO. I'm your employee. Whatever we feel, it's tangled up in power dynamics and workplace politics and 100 other things that make it impossible to see clearly. So we just wait? We wait. You make your decision about the company. I keep my head down and do my job. And when the dust settles, if there's still something there, we figure it out then. And if there isn't?" Carlos closed his eyes. "Then at least we'll know." They hung up without saying goodbye. It felt like a rehearsal for a larger ending. 1 week later, Rachel stood in front of the entire company. The all-hands meeting had been called with less than 24 hours' notice, and speculation was rampant. Layoffs, restructuring, a merger announcement. Nobody expected what came next. "I've spent 15 years building Meridian Technologies," Rachel began, her voice steady and clear through the auditorium speakers. "I've given everything to this company, my time, my energy, my marriage, my health, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished together." She let the words settle before continuing. "But I've realized something important recently. I've spent so long becoming what this company needed that I forgot who I was before it existed. I forgot that success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. I forgot that power is just another kind of prison if you can't walk away from it." Carlos stood in the back of the auditorium, watching her. He saw her hands gripping the podium, the only sign of the turmoil beneath her composed exterior. "Effective immediately. I'm accepting the acquisition offer from Hartwell Industries. The deal will close within 90 days, and I will be stepping down as CEO at that time. I won't be staying on in any capacity. This chapter of my life is ending." The auditorium erupted in murmurs. People exchanged shocked glances. Somewhere near the front, David Porter looked like he'd been handed the keys to the kingdom. But Rachel wasn't finished. "I want to leave you with one thought. I've spent 15 years believing that my value came from what I could control. From the deals I closed, the competitors I crushed, the empire I built. But recently, someone reminded me that real value comes from something else entirely. From being present, from being human, from building a life instead of a brand." Her eyes swept across the auditorium, and for one brief moment, they found Carlos in the back. The connection lasted less than a second, invisible to everyone except the two of them. "I wish all of you the success I chased. But more than that, I wish you the wisdom to know when enough is enough. Thank you for everything. It's been an honor." She walked off the stage without taking questions. Carlos didn't follow her. He didn't seek her out in the chaos that followed. He simply walked out of the auditorium, drove home, picked up Zoe from her after-school program, made dinner, helped with homework, and put his daughter to bed. Later, sitting alone in his living room, he processed what had happened. Rachel had made her choice. She'd walked away from everything she'd built, and in her speech, she'd acknowledged him without naming him. She told a roomful of people that someone had changed her perspective, but she'd made the decision alone. She hadn't called him beforehand. She hadn't asked his opinion or sought his input. She'd simply decided, announced, and departed. It was the same pattern she'd always followed. Control everything, include no one. Carlos should have felt relieved. The power dynamic was dissolving. Within 90 days, she wouldn't be his CEO anymore. The obstacle between them would disappear. Instead, he felt something closer to disappointment. She'd given up an empire, but she hadn't changed the fundamental way she operated. She still made decisions in isolation. She still kept everyone at arm's length, including him, maybe especially him. He didn't hear from Rachel in the days that followed. The company buzzed with transition planning, and Carlos threw himself into his work. The new leadership would need competent people who understood operations, and he intended to prove his value on merit alone, untouched by whatever rumors still circled. Zoe asked about the sad lady again. "Did you help her feel better, Daddy?" Carlos was tucking her in, smoothing the blanket around her small body. "I tried, baby, but sometimes people need to help themselves first." "That's what you always say about me and my homework." He laughed despite himself. "Yeah, I guess it is. Is she going to be okay?" Carlos thought about Rachel, alone in that empty penthouse, stripped of everything that had defined her for 15 years. He thought about the look in her eyes during her final speech, the vulnerability beneath the composure. "I hope so," he said honestly. "I really hope so." But hope and certainty were different things. And as the days turned into weeks, as the acquisition moved forward and Rachel's presence faded from the company like a ghost leaving a house, Carlos began to wonder if whatever had existed between them had been nothing more than a moment. A single night of connection that had burned bright and then disappeared into the dark. He told himself that was probably for the best. He almost believed it. 1 month after Rachel's departure, Carlos received a promotion. The new leadership at Meridian recognized what the old regime had overlooked. 4 years of quiet competence, flawless operational management, and the ability to stay calm when everything around him descended into chaos. They offered him a senior coordinator position with a significant raise and actual decision-making authority. He accepted. It was everything he'd never allowed himself to want. But the victory felt hollow. At night, after Zoe was asleep, Carlos would sit on his couch and stare at the spot where Rachel had lain that night. The cushions had long since forgotten the shape of her body. The blanket had been washed and folded and put away. There was no evidence she'd ever been there at all, except in his memory, except in the way he still looked toward the door sometimes, half expecting to hear that desperate knock. He told himself it was better this way. The power imbalance was gone, but so was Rachel. She'd vanished from public life completely. No interviews, no social media presence, no sightings at industry events. The woman who'd built a $200 million empire had simply disappeared. Carlos could have reached out. He had her number. But every time he picked up his phone, the same question stopped him. What would he say? What could he offer a woman who'd had everything and walked away from it? His small apartment, his ordinary life, his daughter who needed stability, not a father entangled with someone still figuring out who she was? So he waited. And the waiting turned into weeks. And the weeks turned into something that felt permanent. Zoe stopped asking about the sad lady. Children were resilient that way. They accepted the disappearance of adults from their lives with a flexibility that Carlos envied. One day, Rachel existed in her 7-year-old mind, and the next day, she didn't. If only it were that easy for him. The encounter happened on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks after Rachel's resignation. Carlos was standing outside Zoe's school, waiting for dismissal like he did every day. Parents clustered in small groups, discussing homework and soccer practice and the endless logistics of raising children. He stood apart from them, as he always did, checking emails on his phone. A woman approached the school entrance from the opposite direction. She wore simple clothes, jeans, and a light sweater, nothing like the power suits Carlos remembered. Her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail. She carried herself differently, too, without the rigid posture of someone constantly performing strength. It took him a moment to recognize Rachel. She saw him at the same instant. Her steps faltered. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the schoolyard. Rachel spoke first, crossing the distance between them. "I didn't know Zoe went to school here. I swear I'm not stalking you." "What are you doing here?" "Career day." She gestured toward the building. "A parent I met at a charity event asked if I'd speak to the kids about entrepreneurship. I didn't realize until I arrived that it was this school." Carlos studied her face, looking for signs of the desperation he'd seen that night. Instead, he found something else. Uncertainty, yes, but also a clarity that hadn't been there before. She looked like someone who'd stopped running. "How are you?" he asked. "Honestly? I have no idea." Rachel offered a small smile. "I've been waking up every morning without a schedule for the first time in 15 years. Some days I don't know what to do with myself. Other days I remember that's exactly the point. Sounds disorienting. It is. But it's also something else." She searched for the word. "Real. For the first time in as long as I can remember, my life feels real instead of performed." The school bell rang, and children began pouring through the doors. Parents moved forward to collect their kids, and the orderly waiting area dissolved into happy chaos. Carlos spotted Zoe emerging with her backpack dragging on the ground as usual. Then he saw his daughter notice Rachel. Recognition lit up her face. "It's the sad lady." Zoe ran toward them, stopping directly in front of Rachel. "Are you feeling better now? Daddy said you were trying to help yourself like I do with my homework." Rachel knelt down to meet Zoe at eye level. "Your daddy was right. I've been working very hard on helping myself." "Did it work?" "I think so. I'm still figuring some things out, but I'm better than I was." Zoe considered this with the gravity only a 7-year-old could muster. "That's good. Daddy was worried about you, even though he didn't say so. I could tell because he kept looking at the couch." Carlos felt his face warm. Leave it to his daughter to announce his secrets to the world. Rachel glanced up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "He was worried about me? He worries about everyone. That's just how Daddy is." Zoe tugged on Carlos's hand. "Can we invite her for dinner now? You make really good pasta, and you said she needed people to share things with." The silence stretched between the three of them. Carlos saw Rachel's eyes, the hope she was trying to hide. The fear of rejection she couldn't quite mask. He saw his daughter, blissfully unaware of the complexity she'd stumbled into, just wanting to help someone feel less sad. And he saw himself, standing at another crossroads. The safe choice was clear: politely decline, maintain boundaries, protect the stable life he'd built. That's what the old Carlos would have done. But the old Carlos had also spent years hiding from risk, convincing himself that safety was the same as happiness. And look where that had gotten him. A tidy apartment, a successful career, and a couch he couldn't stop staring at because it reminded him of the one night when something had actually felt alive. "Do you like pasta?" he asked Rachel. Her eyes widened slightly. "What?" "Zoe's right. I make good pasta. Nothing fancy, just something I learned from my grandmother." "If you're free tonight." Rachel stood slowly, her gaze moving between Carlos and Zoe. "Are you sure? I don't want to intrude on your life. I know I've already caused enough disruption. You showed up at my door at 5 in the morning. I think we're past worrying about intrusion." For the first time since he'd known her, Rachel laughed. A real laugh, unguarded and warm. That's fair. They walked to Carlos's apartment together, Zoe chattering between them about her school day and her friends, and a boy named Tyler who kept stealing her crayons. Rachel listened with genuine attention, asking questions and responding to Zoe's stories as if they were the most important things in the world. Carlos watched the interaction carefully. He'd always believed that you could judge someone's character by how they treated children. Rachel wasn't performing patience or faking interest. She was simply present, engaged, human. Maybe she really had changed, or maybe this was who she'd always been underneath the armor. In his kitchen, Carlos cooked while Rachel sat at the counter with Zoe, helping her with a coloring book. The domestic